Hello, class. This is our third lesson on the content for Catching Dreams, and we are going to talk about reservations. So our essential questions: what is a reservation? What is the Bureau of Indian Affairs? What is life like on a reservation? And what are some of the current issues on reservations? So when you look here, this is a map of American Indian reservations. The purple ones are federal reservations. The green ones are state reservations. There aren't very many state reservations comparatively, and they're mostly here on the East Coast. And then there is one here in Georgia and up here in Michigan. The federal reservations, you can see where there's a lot of clusters at. Over here is the Navajo and Hopi, that's the largest. And then you have the various Northwest Plains state reservations, a lot of small ones, and then the really large ones like Pine Ridge. So what a reservation is, it's land that's managed by a Native American tribe rather than by a state. So this was land that was given to the Native Americans during the time of Western expansion. Sometimes, though, the government decided that they wanted the land after all, so they would go back in and move all the Indians to a different reservation and then use the land that used to be theirs. So Native Americans were forced to move from their traditional homelands to the government-gifted reservations, and some of them could be quite far away from where they lived. Let's flip back a minute and talk about the Cherokee and the Trail of Tears, which I'm sure you have heard about sometime in your life. This is our band of the Cherokee, which was once the homeland of the Cherokee here in the Appalachian Mountains, North Carolina, Tennessee area. And this is the Oklahoma Cherokee Reservation. So what they did was they forced them to march in the winter all this way. That's a long way. You're crossing mountains and plains, and you end up in this part of Oklahoma, which is entirely different. As you know, North Carolina is southern, and even in the mountains it's warm and there's trees, and we have snow and everything else there too, but it's a very different type of environment, very mountainous, and Oklahoma is very flat and plains and dry and hot. Not all tribes has a reservation. There's a lot of tribes that were never even given a homeland, and people don't realize that. People think that all Native Americans are associated with reservations, but they are not. And a non-native cannot live on a reservation. I could not go buy a house on a reservation. And this is a photograph, an old photograph, obviously, of early reservation, and you see the military in the background observing the Native Americans as they. So these are in North Carolina, tribal and urban Indian communities. So if you have, we have the eastern band of the Cherokee, which I just talked about, which is really large. And then these are tribal communities. They are not reservations, but you have the Cherokee's the only official reservation. The Lumbee is down here in our area, and a lot of people don't realize how many Native American settlements and homelands we have that are right here. So reservation government is different. They have tribal sovereignty, which means their laws are their own, and they don't have to follow always the state law or the government law. If there is a crime, the case is tried by a tribal council, and this gives them their own governance, but the way that it was written in, it also limits government aid. So if there is, for example, a natural disaster happens, the reservations would not get federal disaster aid the way that we got aid, for example, during Hurricane Florence. And because of systematic prejudice, which means being prejudiced throughout all of the systems, reservations don't often receive the same rights as American communities, even though Native Americans are American citizens. They weren't for a long time, but they are now, and they can vote and hold office. And it's complicated, but a lot of times their rights are not the same. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs is who is in charge of these things. It was founded back in 1824, and it's the branch of the government that is associated with Native Americans. It was created to literally, quote, solve the Indian problem, which was by removing them. And removing included the genocide, and then also the forced relocation to the reservations, and then forced assimilation. And this lasted into the 1970s, where they educated, in quotes, Native children by taking them away from their families and putting them in Indian schools in order to learn white culture. And these schools still exist. There is a picture of one with the students, and they were not schools like our schools, exactly. So what happened when you went to an Indian school, you were given a new name, a white name. You could only speak English, and you were punished severely if you tried to speak your native language. And the education often was work without payment. So they would be educated, again in quotes, in how to work on an assembly line in a factory, or how to put together small things, equipment, tools, things of that nature. So it was basically forced labor and child labor, that. So there were Reformation and rights. The Indian Affairs began reforming in 1930 with a move towards tribal recognition and rights. In 1924, Native Americans were granted citizenship, but they were not allowed to vote unless they revoked tribal membership and all of the things that came with it, including their property on the reservation. In the 1950s, over 100 tribes were terminated. That doesn't mean they were killed, not this time. What it means was the government decided that they weren't a tribe. They just decided that because they wanted their land. So they took their land away because no longer can you have a reservation if you're not a tribe. And we're going to relocate you to cities, and you lose all of your federal autonomy as tribes. And that was a bad thing. In 1962, voting rights happened in all states. Native Americans were allowed to vote. In 1978, there was a federal act protecting the removal of children to Indian schools, and it also granted religious freedom to Native Americans. 1978 was the year that it became legal for a Native American to own a dream catcher. Before that time, it was considered illegal for them to own one and treasonous because they were a symbol and used for unity during the time of the ghost dance. It wasn't enforced, truthfully, later on in the 1900s, but in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they took it very seriously. In 1980, Native Americans were permitted to run for county offices. They could, become a county coroner or whatever. And then in 2019, the Voting Rights Protection Act was passed, And what that meant was that all Native Americans need to have access to places where they are allowed to vote. Because a lot of times, even though they were given voting rights in 1962, locations for them to vote at would be nowhere near where they lived. They would have to travel hundreds of miles sometimes in order to vote, and a lot of them didn't have the transportation or ability to travel that far. In 2020, just as another aside, though I didn't put it on here, going back to the 100 tribes terminated, it was passed where some of that land was restored in the state of Oklahoma to the native owners. So life on a reservation. Reservations can be similar to our general American lives. They can have housing developments and look like, very stereotypical, like subdivisions. They can have neighborhoods and businesses and industries and schools and hospitals and all the other things, plus casinos, which is an income source. And casinos was a major income source. Casino gambling, which you might know if you ever had one of the gambling classes that Ms. Cluett used to teach. Casino gambling is mostly illegal everywhere except for Nevada, the state, and on Native American reservations and on the water. So this was a big deal, and they have huge casinos. And they're really super nice. However, when COVID happened, they had to shut them down. And one of the curious things about shutting down the casinos was they didn't complain about it. They did not say, no, we have to stay open because this is our only income. They said, okay, because they have a cultural memory of things like when smallpox wiped out a large percentage of their people. And they understood right away that COVID was very, very serious. Native American reservations also can have very large areas with limited resources. It's common, especially in the West. They don't have running water. They don't have health care, electricity, internet, maintain roads, or other infrastructure. A lot of those things are provided by the federal government. And remember what I told you a few minutes ago, if you are a sovereign area, the federal government doesn't provide all this stuff like interstates and, roads and the money, the grants needed to build hospitals. A lot of the reservation areas, because they were designed that way, are very, very remote. And they don't have running water because there isn't any water. Where I stay, out west, water is very scarce. You don't just, pull up a well in your yard or tap into the city water. A lot of times, like you see in the bottom, you have to go with your truck and a big bladder and fill up at a water station, and then you take it home and you put it in a cistern and you put it in barrels and other containers, and that's where you get your water for everything, from bathroom and showers to cooking and cleaning and washing your clothes, and if you have animals, watering your animals. It's something that we tend to take for granted here, that water, we turn on and there it is, except for during hurricanes, where out there water is a really big deal. So life on a reservation, it's a blend of traditional and modern beliefs. There are some very modern lifestyles, and then there are some people who choose to live in the total traditional way. Most people are kind of a mixture of the two. And their spiritual practices include both native religions and Christianity. And children on the reservations are taught native history, arts, and belief systems, and native language education. However, there are still some children that are sent to Indian schools. Indian schools still exist, and you get sent to them if your family if something happens, if you become an orphan, or your family is deemed unfit to take care of you, and you'll be taken off and placed into an Indian school. So a lot of times the housing on the reservation, the traditional housing, some of it that is still used, the pueblos that you see here on top, and some of these pueblos, like Sky City and Acoma, it's the largest and longest continually inhabited place in North America. People have been living in the pueblo for thousands of years and still live there today. And it looks like that on the outside, and inside you have like a more modern kind of room. And then on the bottom is a modern hogan, which is a Navajo-styled house. And you have the domed roof with the earth on it. And what the earth does, it insulates the house from both the heat and the cold, the multi-sides. And likewise, there are usually not any windows. And again, that has to do with keeping the house cool in the summer and warm in the winter. And the doors open for ventilation. Most of the life is lived outside. So there are current issues on reservations. Healthcare is a top issue at the moment. Reservations were hit extremely hard by COVID, and that is because of reduced information. When you're remote like that, you don't have access to the internet or TV, a lack of healthcare, again, no hospitals, and infection through tourism. So tourists bringing COVID into the casinos and onto the reservations. And then other continuing healthcare issues include substance abuse, nutrition, and a very low life expectancy. So reservations very rapidly last spring were closed to non-residents during the pandemic, and there is a picture of a roadblock going into the reservation where you were not allowed to drive through a reservation. You couldn't visit, but you couldn't even drive through it. You had to drive around it, and they took it extremely seriously. The conditions, they brought in Doctors Without Borders in order to help with the health care because things got so bad. And then there's environmental issues. They have ongoing environmental conflicts. Part of this is because when they were given the reservations, they were given the surface land and not anything below what was on top. And that idea permitted the government to come in when they discovered uranium deposits in Utah and start mining uranium on the reservation because the uranium belonged to the government and they had to get it out. And yes, the natives owned the top, but they really couldn't do anything else about it. Same thing on Pawnee land. They went in and did the fracking. And then the recent Keystone Pipeline proposal, which has been this huge war. And the deal with the pipeline is the pipeline runs through the water sources. Again, remember how incredibly important water is. It's not everywhere like it is here. And if something should happen to the pipeline, and yes, things happen to pipelines all the time. I've got family that's worked on pipelines. It leaks into the water system, it pollutes the water bed, the aqueous filter in the earth, and it can cause all sorts of problems. And because reservations are on government soil that's not under state control, environmental regulations, protection of burial sites, water rights, and protections are not acknowledged. Anything on the surface falls in eminent domain, which means it can be seized without payment for public use. You might have heard people talking about this in cases, because that exists everywhere, not just on reservations. If they want to widen a road, for example, they might take part of your front yard as eminent domain, and it just suddenly belongs to the government instead of you in order to make the road wider. And this is an image of the Standing Rock Sioux protest against the pipeline. And reservations have protocols. If you visit a reservation once they open again, you can't just do anything you want to. So I want you to experience this because some of them are very surprising. So I've linked a website, and there's protocols there for visiting the Navajo or Dene reservation, or nation, which is huge. And I want you to read through them and choose one or more rules that surprised you. How is it different from non-reservation life, and why do you think that rule exists? And I do hope you get to go to the areas where the reservations are at some point, or just to travel and see the rest of the country, because it's really amazing. Okay? So, let's see what's up.